Good evening. Welcome to Fiveable stream on the Russian Revolution. My name is Liam Mackler, and I'm a teacher in New York. I teach AP Europe, and I also teach APUSH. Can everyone hear me in the chat and the group? So just give me a thumbs up if everyone can hear me loud and clear. So we're already entering, great. So we're entering period 4 already. Anyone want to tell us what they're studying right now? I'm actually just teaching World War I, so I'm pretty close to around, I'm assuming most of you are around period 4, studying around the Russian Revolution and around the topics we're covering for tonight. So World War I, okay, great. So around the same topic, it should be around period 4. Exam is coming up around May. So if you have any other general question around period 4, if I know them, I'll be glad to help around tonight. So let's get into it. So again, remember, think Fiveable, follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Fiveable is free now, so you can tell all your friends. No more need for Fiveable Plus subscription, so you can watch the replays. There's going to be some study guides coming out, also helping you before the exam. And again, watching replays of these videos is any topic you're not very familiar with, or your teacher skipped it, so maybe Fiveable can help you in that department. Okay, so tonight's stream, we are covering the Russian Revolution, which is a very big topic in this exam. It pops up every year or so. Last year, I think it was in the SAQ. A couple years ago, it was an LAQ question. So it still seemed to come up every couple of year or so. So if you're on the stream tonight, you are doing helping yourself up prepare for this exam. So what are we going to talk about tonight's stream? We'll talk about before the big communist revolution in 1917, what was the situation in pre-revolutionary Russia. 1905, there was a first revolution attempt that failed. We'll talk about that. Then we're going to go into the causes of the revolution, what caused the Russian Revolution. Definitely in the test, they could be a causation question. What caused the revolution? And again, you might want to think a lot of times you approach a topic, what kind of a question will they ask me? And usually they like to ask questions regarding causation, what caused something, or effects of things, or continuity and change, what stayed the same and what has changed. So think about that. So we're going to talk about the two revolutions. A lot of people actually do not know that there were two revolutions in the communist revolution, the February Revolution, that failed basically for the communists to take over, and then finally the October Revolution. And once the revolution was over and the communists took over, it wasn't as simple as they thought it would be. Russia is going to go into a civil war that's going to last for around 4 years, and eventually the communists will come on top. So these are the topic we will cover for tonight. Basically, we're going to try to cover tonight how we're going to transition from the left side to the right side of the screen, from the old Russian flag to the Soviet Union flag, that if many of you do not recognize it or were not alive during the age of the Soviet Union, like your teachers, you might not recognize this flag. And now we're actually today going back to the Russian flag. So it's a lot of back and forth going on. So tonight we're going to talk about from Russia to the Soviet Union, how that transition happened, and how Russia became the first European country to follow the Marxist teaching and become communist. Okay? Any questions up till now? If you have anything, drop it in the ask a question button or drop it in the chat room. Okay? Everyone can hear me? All good? All right, so let's get into it. So let's talk about pre-revolutionary Russia, 1905 to 1917. So just big picture event in case you haven't studied too much about Russia up till now in your class. So we're getting into the 20th century, and all of Europe basically is giving up their citizen many rights, such as there is almost most of Western Europe in that stage has male suffrage. All men have the right to vote. They are allowing union to exist. Almost all of European society have some form of a parliament in place. In England, it's been for hundreds of years. State assembly, even Germany, a lot of places are giving basic social rights for people, like health insurance, such as Germany. So all of Europe is kind of becoming more westernized and modernized. So Russia is like the only true full-blown autocracy that is left in Europe in the early 20th century. So you can definitely understand a causation why there was going to be a revolution. And they do not actually even have any type of representative political institution. It's amazing that they made it up to the 20th century without even anybody in place. And the czar that we're talking about, the czar that is going to be the ruler during the revolution, it's probably one of only two czars you need to know for this exam, is Tsar Nicholas II. He's going to become czar in 1884. So there's only one dynasty you need to know for Russian history, and that's the Romanovs. All the czars come from the same line family that they ruled Russia for around 300 years. Almost all of the Romanovs were full-blown autocrats that did not want to share any power. The only emperor you might want to know for the exam that did some reform is Tsar Alexander II. And he's the one that freed the serfs and tried to create some reforms to make Russia a little bit more westernized and modernize a little bit Russia. But the thank you that he got is actually he got assassinated in 1881. So after him, it's kind of like all the czars that followed him went back to the old ways of full-blown autocracy with no rights to people. So the czar during the Russian Revolution is Tsar Nicholas II, and he takes the throne in 1884. And he also kind of like, if you study Louis XIV, the divine right theory, he's kind of on the same page that he believes that he has absolute power anointed by God, that nobody should question him. Now, a big turning point that leads into the Russian Revolution of 1905, there's the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. And that's another important topic if you're studying social Darwinism or theories regarding race. It was a very, very big surprise to all of Europe, around the world, that actually Japan defeated mighty Russia. So the race theory or social Darwinism did not pan out in the Russian-Japanese War. And to the surprise of everyone, small Asian people, that's what racist people said, not me, defeated the mighty, strong Russians. So this was a very, very big humiliation for Russia. And that is the background why we have the revolution in 1905. In 1905, we have the first attempt in the revolution in Russia. It starts up with 200,000 workers who are peacefully marching to the Tsar's palace in Petrograd, later known as also historically as St. Petersburg, and they want to petition for a reform. Now, Nikolai, being a dictator that he is, basically sends the guard and orders them to fire into the crowd, and hundreds of people are dead. So the revolution of 1905, basically that events of firing into the crowd starts a whole series of strikes and violence that spreads all around Russia. And eventually the Tsar basically wants to compromise a little bit and issues the October Manifesto. In it, basically, he promises that there will be freedom and there will be some civil rights. And finally, hallelujah, Russia will have its own body representative of people. So if you want to remember, the Russian parliament is called the Duma. There are just a few terms you might want to know for, like, if you write an essay about Russia. Every country in Europe that you study for this exam, there's probably a few terms: the name of their parliament, the name of their leader. So Tsar is the name of the ruler of Russia. It's kind of like Caesar, but in Russian. Same thing. You got Kaiser for Germany. So the Tsar in Russia is saying yes to the creation of the Duma. But the Duma really never really gets any power, and the industrialization in Russia is still very, very slow, and all of these problems will come back again and when we get to World War I. So Tsar Nicholas makes a lot of promises with the October Manifesto. There's a lot of celebration. You can see in the image on the right side. Everyone thinks that Russia is going to move towards a constitutional monarchy. The revolution subside down, and it seems very, very quickly that there won't be any that they won't, that he's not going to give them any of the demands that they felt for. So October Manifesto celebration, Russia is going to give some rights to the people, but then turns out there are no rights to be given to the people. So any questions up till now? Let's see what we have. Sorry, 1 second here. Can see the ask a question. All right, so we have the first question. Yes, is there any specific reason why the revolution happened at this time instead of earlier on? Okay, good question. Again, there were previous attempts. You might want to remember the Decemberist revolt in 1825 that already happened before, and it was suppressed very, very harshly. Just think about Russia as a very authoritarian state. If people rise up, usually the Tsars use the army to crush it very quickly. Why it specifically happened in 1905? It could be the context is the humiliation to the defeat of Japan, and it could be also that the people just demonstrated peacefully, and they were very, very upset by the reaction of the Tsars. So yes, Russia is like sees, or a lot of people, there are a lot of dissidents group. Nobody's really, really happy in Russia. The peasants are not happy. The elites are not happy. So 1905, it explodes. I would say the context is probably the Japanese Russian war that started this whole thing. Okay, good question. If you have any other question, please drop it in the chat box. Everyone can hear me loud and clear? All right, let's continue. 1 second here. Oops, internet problem. Let's get back into it. All right, let's get now to the causes of the revolution of 1917. You might get a question of causes. What caused the revolution? What caused the war? First off, the context is World War I. If you're probably studying World War I, Russia is coming into World War I. They're very unprepared for this war. They're not industrialized completely yet. Low morale around the soldiers. Russia is being defeated in several battles. So definitely World War I is, if the Japanese Russian war gives us the revolution in 1905, definitely World War I gives us the Russian Revolution in 1917. Could be if there would be no World War I would estimate. You can definitely make a thesis about that. That probably won't be the Russian Revolution. And again, it's the similar thing to 1905. There's the dissident elites. The elites are siding with the peasants. Both of them are in opposition to the Tsar. Nobody's really happy in Russia. The peasants are not happy. They have to suffer during the war, barely having any food. A lot of it might be taken to the army. The elites are not happy. They want more rights. The bourgeois, those who are progressed in the city, are not getting enough rights. So very quickly, a lot of the country is anti-war. They want to pull away from this war, and they're also anti-Tsar. And throw into the mix, we also have the socialists, what we'll talk about tonight. Socialism is also rising up in Russia. So all of these groups have a unifying motivations. They all are not happy with the Tsar. And also to add to that, the shortage of food and basically creates a massive crisis. So all of these are leading us to World War I. And key figures to pushing onto World War I is Tsar Nicholas II, who we can definitely just say that he was very, very incompetent. If you want to compare and contrast, he's kind of like maybe Louis XVI in France. We have an undecisive ruler here in the middle of a crisis, and he doesn't know actually what to do. And most of the time, he's actually picking the wrong lane that makes things a lot worse. One example of that, if we will, is the fact that he believes that because Russia is losing battle, that he's going to join World War I as a general and lead the army into victory. So he's going to go to the front line. Big mistake. He's a horrible general, and he's just going to make the situation worse for his country. His wife, Alexandra, also very unpopular, also creating a lot of hatred in Russia towards the government. So these two are very, very big problem for the Russian people. So the Tsar government, one more time, we're talking about it. It's an autocracy. It's ruled by one person, but he's not really too much involved in the government. He's one of these dictators who likes to hang in a home with the family and the kids and not really running things too much. His wife has a very big influence on him because he's a very undecisive person. Again, if you want to do compare and contrast, not saying she's Marie Antoinette, but Marie Antoinette had a lot of influence on Louis XVI. So here's another example of a wife that influences her husband a lot. And we can definitely say that they're both very incompetent. Now, to add into the mix of why they're not popular and making bad decisions, also, very, very famous person here below, Rasputin. There are many songs about him and many movies and a lot of funny things. He's a very, very odd character. He was kind of a mystic healer, and he had a lot of influence on the Tsar and his wife, especially Alexandra, because she had a son, their only son, was suffering from hemophilia, and she felt that this Rasputin guy is going to heal her son. So that's the kind of magic power that he had over her during that time. But the Tsar government is not functioning very well during World War I. There's food shortages, fuel shortages, there's inflation, and we have the Tsar going into the front line, leaving behind his wife to run things. And a lot of people are upset that Rasputin is the guy behind her. Also, the military is very, very corrupt. Like most of the time in dictatorship, there's a lot of corruption. People on the top just steal, and people are starving. That's the same situation that is happening in a lot of dictatorship. If you want to think about North Korea as an example today, these things constantly happen. But the army is not prepared for the war. They're ill-trained. The officers a lot of time are very, very corrupt. The soldiers are poorly equipped to get into the war versus Germany, who are there fighting, who has got a army in top shape with all the latest technology. So it's very, very quickly Russia has been humiliated one battle after the other. And also, if you're studying World War I, an example that you might want to give if they ask about mutinies or during the war, definitely the Russians are seeing high numbers of desertion, that people are leaving the front lines after a few years. And again, it's one thing if 1,000 people, 2,000 people are running away, you can grab them or execute them or punish them. But if you have millions of people escaping the front line, how you don't have enough people to send to stop them. So most Russians, average peasants, are not interested in this war. Soldiers are humiliated by this war, and fighting this war basically drains Russia out of its limited resources as it is. And Nicholas thinks that his solution to the problem, that he is going to go to the front line and save Russia from this war. And it turns out he's not very good at that, and he actually makes the situation even worse by going to the front line. And that's a good time also to bring into that Russia is, anyone recognize this guy in the picture over here? Who is this guy? So what's the right? What's on his right? Anyone? Okay, so this is Karl Marx, of course, the guy who created Marxism. There's another stream on socialism, if you want to watch that one, that gives you a little background about the whole story, and the Communist Manifesto, the ideology. So Russia is definitely has the influence of the ideology of Marxism. So watch the stream about the rise of socialism, the whole ideology. Marx, by the way, did not create socialism. There's utopian socialists. But Karl Marx, who's from Germany, who comes from a Jewish family, and he's actually a newspaper writer most of his life, had a theory that the working class, not peasants, will eventually start a revolution and are in industrial nations and are going to take away the rights of basically get rid of the bourgeois. So proletarian workers will one day unite and kick out the owners of the factory. That was his theory. Now, Russians are influenced by the Marxist theory, and two groups kind of emerge before the Russian revolutions with kind of different interpretation and playing on Marx. One group is the Mensheviks, and the other group is the Bolshevik. Now, Bolsheviks actually means majority in Russian, and Menshevik means minority. But interestingly enough, the Bolsheviks were not the majority. So their deception starts by just naming themselves the majority group, which they were not. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin. He's a very important person. You want to write his name down for this exam. And he believed a little bit different than Marx, that Marx claimed that that a group of proletarian workers, once they come into knowledge, that they will start the revolution. Lenin plays on Marx and interpret that actually a small professional vanguard, people from the top, can bring a socialist revolution into his society. So even poor peasants in Russia, he claimed, can actually start a revolution. Now, his theory, you might want to know for this exam, is known as the Marxist-Leninist ideology. So taking Marx and interpreting that a small group of people can start a revolution. The majority group of the socialists are known as the Mensheviks, that they believe, kind of more close to Marx, that Russia needs to go through an industrialization process. And once they're going to be a little bit more sizable working class, then Russia can come into an understanding and go into a revolution. So this is a split between these two workers' parties that eventually the Bolsheviks eventually will take over and lead the communist revolution with their ideology, which is more radical. So now when we get to the revolutions, there are two revolutions you might want to know for the test. One of those is the February Revolution, and the other one is known as the October Revolution. Now, the dates are a little bit different when they actually happen, because the Russians are using Gregorian calendar, so don't get confused with that. So the February Revolution actually happened in March, and the October Revolution, which is the communist revolution, the successful one, actually happened in November. So just in case you get confused with the dates, I actually wrote it down, and so you can see the differences. Okay, so now let's get in and talk about these two separate revolutions. Any questions up to now? See? All right, we are good. Let's continue. All right, so the first attempt, and again, this is happening, the context of the February Revolution is the failure of World War I, that Russia is constantly losing. Similar situation to the revolution in 1905. We got more than 100,000 men and women who are marching again to Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and now they're demanding things like food, an end to the war, and shouting down with the Tsar. And once again, in March 11 and 12, the soldiers are sent to put this rebellion down and fire into the crowd. But this time, if you want to do compare and contrast, in 1905, they actually fired into the crowd. Here in 1917, they decide not to fire into the crowd. So what made the change? It could be that soldiers were also frustrated with the war itself. So this actually happens very, very quickly. Once the soldiers refuse to fire into the crowd, and actually in some cases join the crowd into the demonstration, then basically the system falls apart very, very quickly. By the way, the Tsar is actually in the front line, and wants to return back. His train is actually stopped. And he's not given too many options, and everyone is basically, you have to abdicate. And the Tsar very, very quickly abdicates, and a provisional government is sent up. So the February Revolution, very quickly, in just a few days, we have, to the surprise of a lot of people, the Tsar abdicates. They're offering the crown to his brother, who refuses, and that's the end of the Romanovs. After 300 years, Russia will never have a Tsar again. That's the end of the Romanov dynasty. So the February Revolution seems to move very, very quickly, the abdication of the Tsar. So we can see a picture here of people with the demonstrations that quickly escalated into the February Revolution that was successful, and the Tsar abdicates. Now, the next question is what's going to happen now that the Tsar abdicates? Who's going to take over? And that's a question that happens in many dictatorships today, or in many countries. We saw it like in the Arab Spring, for example. It's one thing, or in the French Revolution, it's one thing to topple the government, but the next question is how many people, who's going to take power instead of them. So that's a very serious question. So when Nicola abdicates, they put in place a provisional government that hopefully people believed, that eventually would like set up a new constitution or have some election or something like that. So the parliament, the Duma, decides to pick a new form of provisional government, which is made up a lot of upper class people, and that's why they're not really trusted by the people. And eventually the leadership is given to a moderate socialist, Alexander Kerensky. You can see a picture of him on the right side over here. And the government is basically, from the get-go, is not popular with the Soviets. So if you see the term Soviets, it's basically kind of councils of representative of workers and socialists. Later on, Russia is going to be called the United Socialist Soviet Republic, so USSR. So the Soviets are basically small councils of people. The most important one, the one who's setting up to the Russian, later on to the Communist Revolution, is the Petrograd Soviets, that is claims to be the legitimate government to run all Russia, and actually tells officers that they don't have to listen to the government anymore. So that's a very important effect. So the Duma members they come from the upper class, higher jobs. So a lot of people felt like they were not really representing the regular people. And one of the biggest, in retrospect, mistakes that the provisional government did is they decided to continue the war with Germany. Very, very big mistake. It's the whole thing that people hated the war and they wanted to go to a revolution, and now the government is deciding to stay in the revolution. And the question is, why did they decide to stay in the revolution? We don't know exactly. Probably out of nationalistic reason. They felt it's going to be humiliating for Russia to leave the war. So they're kind of like really not connecting to the general feeling that most Russians want out of this war. So one of the things is going to doom this new provisional government is the decision to stay in the war, and they do not have the support of the workers or the peasants that make the biggest percentage of the population. So Kerensky patriotism, and also maybe thinking also that he might get support later on from the Allies. He's thinking about financial support from the Allies, technical aid, economic aid. He's thinking if they stay in the war, they're going to get a lot of this aid, but he's not interested in that. Also, Kerensky, because he's a moderate and not a radical, he's not willing to do any major reforms that the Soviets have been calling for. He's not going to take lands from the rich people and give it to the poor people. There's not going to be redistribution of the lands. Again, he's just a moderate socialist, kind of like a social democrat. He's not like a Marxist by any means. And he's also postponing the election. So all these sort of things are making the government very, very unpopular. Now, this is a very important key turning point for the turning to the communist revolution, that Germany is making a bet. They're making a bet that if they're going to bring back the leader of the Bolsheviks, that we're going to talk in detail about him, Vladimir Lenin, if they're going to send him back, he's in exile, bring him back into Russia, maybe that's going to stir up some communist revolution or bring the communists, and maybe the communists will pull out of this war. So it turns out that the German leaders made a gamble, and guess what? They were totally right. They were right, because Lenin will do exactly as they predicted, come into Russia, and eventually will pull them out of this war. So who is Vladimir Lenin? By the way, all these people, all the leaders of the Communist Party, their last names are not really their name. It's just like they had like names that they were kind of like code names, because a lot of them were constantly running away from authorities. Like Stalin means like Iron Man. Trotsky is not his real last name, and same thing as Lenin. So Lenin, a little bit about him. He actually comes from a middle-class background. His older brother was involved in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the one that actually did some of the reform. So Lenin basically, from the get-go, has a very bad reputation with the authorities, and he is arrested a couple of times and eventually is exiled. And during his time in London, he actually befriends another important communist future leader, Leon Trotsky, who kind of later on becomes his right-hand man. And he keeps a close eye on what's going on in Russia and waits for an opportunity to come back to spread his ideology. So that's kind of on Lenin. So if there any leader they're probably going to ask about in this test, I'm assuming the two main leaders you probably want to know is Lenin or Stalin. So I wouldn't like sweat out the other names. So that's probably the main names you need to know. The other person you might want to mention is Leon Trotsky, who was a very influential politician in the early days of the Soviet Union. He's later on going to be the head of the Russian army, known as the Red Army. And later on, Lenin right-hand man and supposed to be future successor in the job, but we're going to see how that's going to turn out for him. Real name, Leon Bronstein, changes to Trotsky for the war. And finally, the third key of the puzzle, the most important probably future key, is our friend Joseph Stalin, which again, his real name is not Stalin. Stalin translates to Iron Man. His last name is actually Janishvili. And Joseph Stalin is born in Georgia. He grows up in a very rough area that has a lot of gang wars and street wars. He actually has a very brutal father who beats him. He was involved on the early stages of the communist of the communist movement. He was involved in recruiting money by doing bank robberies, assassination attempts, and many other shady things. And he ends up also being in jail several times and being exiled several times. He gets married, has a son. His wife died, has another son later on. He created the newspaper, the communist paper, Pravda, which means truth, but a lot of times they don't publish the truth. That's an interesting thing with the communists. They always have these names that are so completely inaccurate, but that's a little bit we're talking about propaganda. So 3 key people for the Russian Revolution you might want to know: Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. All right, so the February Revolution, as we mentioned. So in the February Revolution, we mentioned the Tsar abdicates very, very quickly. So Lenin and his supporters believe that this is a great time for themselves to take over and have kind of like a communist socialist revolution. Lenin, as we mentioned, is coming back into Russia, and he has a lot of catchy slogans such as "All land to the peasants," "Stop the war now," "Peace, land, and bread." So sometimes you just need like popular slogans, something to resonate with the people. And he does actually resonate with the people, talking about the peasants are suffering, and the provisional government is not doing anything for them. And but they actually fail the revolution in February 1917 because it's too quickly, it's too fast, and their power collapses. And actually Lenin runs away from Russia and believes that he actually misses his chance. And he's not the only one who's trying to take over the government. In September, there's another attempt by an Korleski that you see over here on the right side. Sorry, oops. That also has a failed attempt in September, who's a general, Korolenkov, that also tries to stage a coup in September. And because he's actually staging a coup, the provincial government actually released a lot of the Bolshevik leaders to assist them in putting down this rebellion. And that's basically how we have the October Revolution in 1917. So just to clear everything up, they tried to do a revolution to take over the government a few months back. It failed. They ended up going to jail. Then another general tries to stage a revolution. They need some Soviets to help to put this revolution down. They release him from jail. And this time, Lenin and the Soviets are back again in action. And this time, Lenin believes this is the second chance. So the communists are coalescing powers, actually have a lot of soldiers and navy that supports them in the second attempt. And in November 7, 1917, that's what we call the October Revolution, but it's actually in November, Trotsky is leading soldiers, sailors, and armed workers to the Petrograd, the center of the Russian political system. They take over the communication, government buildings, and the Winter Palace, the headquarters of the government. And Karnesky and the government fled. And the communists, the second attempt is successful. So October Revolution, also known as the Communist Revolution, is successful in 19 1917. So the communists are now in power. How they maintain the power, that's the next question. So any questions up till now? Let's see the chat box. What do we have? And again, if you want to make any comment, if you want to put anything, put it in the chat box. Okay, so let's talk about another thing. Once the communists take over, it's not going to be a smooth transition that they have control over all of the entire Russia. They still have a lot of problems to deal with. They have a war to continue, and they have a lot of enemies who are not happy with the communists taking over. Another interesting, if you want to remember, big picture event, if you studied Unit 7, if you're just studying World War I, you might have learned about the revolutions of 1848. All the previous revolutions in Europe of socialist group that failed. So Marx predicted the revolution will happen in place. He predicted it will happen in place like England. He believed that industrial nations is where the communist revolution will happen. To the surprise of the world, the communist socialist revolution actually happened in Russia and in China, places that did not have a big proletarian population. So interestingly enough, Marx was proven wrong in the two nations where the revolution happened. Now, very quickly, the communists are going to be later. I'm going to have a separate stream about fascism. So they're going to form a kind of dictatorial government. So we're going to put the communists and the fascists in the same categories. All of these forms of government have a secret police. So they create a secret police, which is called the Cheka. And the Chekas is all about spying and arresting anyone who's considered an enemy of the government and anyone who's involved in counter-revolution activities. So that can be anyone who's suspicious, religious people, rich people, bourgeois people, people who are capitalists. So anyone who's seen as suspicious is the Cheka usually tries to arrest. They also execute people and so forth. The Cheka later on will develop at what we know later on today is the KGB and stuff like that. Also, the Bolshevik Party is renamed into the Communist Party. So now we have communism as a new form of government. And Lenin's first task now is the leader of the Communist Party, and now he's the leader of Russia. And by the way, it's very, very interesting. He did not get promoted into the system or anything. He was just the leader of a small political party. They didn't have so many people in the party. They staged a revolution, made a lot of promises, and now basically he's like running the country. So it's very, very quickly for him. His main concern was to get Russia out of the war because he's got to deal with a lot of problems in Russia. So he sent Trotsky to negotiate a treaty with the Germans, and that's another treaty you might want to know for the AP exam, and it's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that it's negotiated with the Germans. And basically the treaty is that Russia gives all the territories that they gained or they had back to the Germans. And basically, so Germany, if you're studying World War I, actually won the war in the East. Russia is out of the war, and Germany is getting a lot of territory in return. A lot of people in Russia were angry about this treaty, but Lenin's main priority was like to consolidate his power. He didn't really care about those territories. So once Russia was out of the war, now the focus on the next stage was a civil war, because not everyone happy in Russia wanted to be communist or want to be under communist leadership. So next stage, we're getting into the Civil War. If I'm going too fast, let me know. If you have any question, drop it in the question box. Let's see. All right, no questions. If you have any comments, you can also put in the chat box. So let's move into the Civil War. The Civil War lasted from around 1917 to 1922. It was, if you want to remember general names, it's between the Reds and the Whites. The red being the color of the communists. The white kind of became the name of the anti-communists, but we don't have an exact name for them. You might want to call them anti-communists or nationalists. So the Red Army was the color of the communists, was consolidated under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. And even though the whites got a lot of help from the Allies, had a lot more supplies and a lot more people, it turns out that they were not united enough. The Reds actually were motivated and were disciplined because they had an ideology. So it's kind of also similar if you study later the Chinese communist revolution. The smaller group actually won because they had an ideology and they had a motivation. They knew what they were fighting for. They had a lot of commissars that came over and taught them ideology, taught them about Marxism, about workers' rights, and a lot of people believed in all these sort of things. The whites, on the other hand, also were not united. They didn't have a specific ideology of what they want instead. All that united them was the fact that they hated the communists or they hated the Reds, but there was no unified. Also, the communists had a very strict discipline. Trotsky, like if soldiers lost a battle, they would kill a certain amount of group of soldiers or execute officers. So this discipline was very, very strong, and they expected high results. And that's another reason why they won. Finally, the war is over with communists, and the Reds are victorious. So now Russia is under the control of the communists and the Reds. Also interesting to mention is that on the last stage, the early stage of the communist revolution, the Romanov, their entire family is executed by the communists. So that includes Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and all of his kids, just to make sure that there won't be any future attempt for anyone from the Romanov dynasty to take power afterwards. Okay, so now let's talk about, this also is in the concept outline you might want to know for this exam, is Stalin, even though he has a communist ideology or Marxist, or we mentioned Marxist Lenin ideology, and he's got a whole economic theory, the economy is doing very, very badly under communism. Employment is really, really high. There's a shortage of food. So Lenin comes up with what is known as the NEP, the New Economic Policy, basically in order to improve the conditions of Russia. He's willing to allow some capitalism, some free market economy to happen. That is very, very shocking to a lot of purist communism. How can we have a communist revolution and he's allowing capitalism to happen? He's not allowing full-blown capitalism, but he's allowing peasants to sell some surplus grains. He's allowing private ownership of lands. But the most important thing, the government is still in control of everything. So the government still controls the bank, major industries, telecommunication. So again, communism is some form of a socialist government, and in communism, usually the government owns all the means of production. So the government is basically in charge of anything. And the new NEP actually works, and by 1922, the economy is more stable. So the NEP, you might want to know it from the test. You think about kind of like maybe like a tactical retreat. He's moving a little bit back, allowing some capitalism to go in place. Shocking to a lot of hardliners, but he's doing that to stabilize the economy and being more pragmatic, if you will, to the success of Russia. But Russia, or now it's the Soviet Union, is a full-blown dictatorship. We're basically switching from an absolute monarch czar to now having another dictator, and that Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin is basically taking away the rights of all the other political party. The only political party that is allowed from now on is the Communist Party. Also moving the capital from St. Petersburg. The capital now is back to Moscow, which was a capital a long time ago. Russia is also renamed now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You probably do not need to know it. Just the initial, the USSR, if you want to remember that. And the USSR is going to last up till 1991. So instead of Russia, now we have the Soviet Union that you're going to study later on in World War II and the Cold War and so forth. And Russia, also in the big context, big picture, is the first modern communist country. And that was a very, very shocking event. If we get out of Russia for a second, sorry, if you take big picture event, this really put a lot of fear all across Europe that the radical socialist ideology actually took over an entire country like Russia. And that's why later on, if you study Hitler or if you study Mussolini, a lot of times people felt, maybe Hitler is not as bad because he's not a communist. Maybe Mussolini is not as bad because he's not a communist. Communist ideology, you might not get it today because we live like in a society that like you barely might know any communist countries around us anymore. Maybe Cuba or China is a little bit more capitalistic today, but communist ideology was very fearful for Europeans, because one of the points of socialism or communism, for example, they don't allow religion. Marx said that, that religion is the opium to the masses. So the fact that Russia became communist is really sending shockwaves all across Europe. Now, also, Stalin, who was in poor bad health, there was also an assassination attempt about him early in the communist revolution. He dies in 1924. Most historians agree that they did not actually point up exact successor, but two people start to fight up after his death, and that is Joseph Stalin, and the other one is Leon Trotsky. Eventually, Stalin will emerge as the successful dictator. Trotsky had a lot more power, the head of the army, but Stalin was very smart in doing a lot of maneuvers and doing a lot of moves to consolidate his power. So Stalin is going to take over power in 1924, and he's going to rule over Russia up till when he dies, which is 1953. So, and Stalin, that's probably another separate stream, probably one of the worst dictators in humankind history, killed around something like 30-40 million of his own people for varieties of horrible ways. So that's pretty much the big picture. If you need to know about Communist Party, what you want to know about the Communist Revolution, how the Russians were successful to install the first communist country in Russia. And again, think Fiveable, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. There's a link also here for my book, Qigong for Beginners. Sorry for the cheap plug, but everyone has got some stuff that they do. So anyway, any Q&A up till now? So if you have any other question, let me know. And again, just to remind you, this is a very big topic that this pops several times in the exam. In the essay format, might be multiple choices, but big picture event that you might want to take away from all of this lecture is that the communist revolution sent shockwaves all around Russia. We have the socialist ideology that starts in one of the isms of the 19th century. If you studied all the other isms, feminism, socialism, nationalism, and conservatism, but in Western Europe, most of the socialist movements kind of found a way inside the government to be a part of the government with social democratic parties. And most people, the communist revolutions that they were attempted, like the German communist revolution, a lot of them failed. So most people did not think that socialists will take over. The fact that Russia had a communist revolution put a lot of fear into a lot of people. Okay, so there's any other questions for today? You can also ask me if you have any questions outside of Russian history. All right. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining tonight, and remember to follow Fiveable. Next week I will do a stream about Impressionism. If you need to have any questions about art, feel free to join me in that lecture. All right, thank you everyone for coming in. Good night.